Pearl has always been my favorite character in Steven Universe. And though the show does not always give her character the most time and the most thought, especially in the latter seasons of the show, that appreciation remains, and Pearl's own imperfection, her own deeply flawed nature, only amplifies and increases that appreciation. Steven Universe, at its core, is a show about growth. It is a show about moving on from the past. It is a show about fundamentally reconsidering your preconceived notions and beliefs, and excitedly marching toward the future. That's not to say the show is always perfect. The world of the show, there is lingering sorrow and suffering and sacrifice, and that's what gives the show its pathos. But the show is quite adamant that people can change and people should try to change. People should aspire to being more open, being more willing to consider new experiences and new ways of thinking about the world, and leave behind old ways of thinking that are not necessarily the most conducive to that openness, to that newness. I think back to the song that Steven sings near the end of the show, not counting Future, which is Change Your Mind. In the end of the Diamond stories. And that's a great song, and it's also a very representative song. Steven Universe is a show about trying to get people to change their minds, trying to get people to reconsider beliefs and opinions that are so dear and so close to them that they can't easily move on from them. And the show is overall quite optimistic. Many antagonists and opponents of Steven do change their mind and become more open and more willing to become sympathetic not just to the gems, but to their overall belief system, which is generally more open, more accepting, more tolerant, more willing to consider a variety of different people and blend them together in this spirit of closeness and diversity and the like. This tendency is so pronounced that it is even mocked somewhat by Spinell in the Steven Universe movie, though even she is not entirely unsusceptible to this tendency in the show. And I suppose all of that in mind is why I find Pearl such an appealing character, because she is one of our heroes. She is very central to the show, and she is, in many respects, virtuous and just and caring. And yet she resists somewhat that tendency to changing her mind, to moving on, to being more open to new experiences and new ways of thinking about the world. She is, certainly by the standards of the show, a sorrowful and a even tragic character in some degrees. I'm, of course, careful not to exaggerate. It's not that Pearl does not change at all, or that she does not slowly accept that Stephen is not Rose, and that Rose did not love her in the way that she loved Greg, and that she should attempt to have new romantic connections and new experiences in that regard and in other regards. But these changes for Pearl are relatively slow and relatively mild. Her fundamental identity is in love and devotion to Rose Quartz. That is fundamentally central to her character. And she is unable to fully move on from that. Unable to fully move on from being centered on Rose in her identity and her way of thinking about the world. And when Rose does anything she didn't expect, or it turns out Rose didn't tell her anything, Pearl continues to feel deeply betrayed. If the show had wanted to, it could have devoted more time to Pearl succeeding in moving on to some extent, in banishing the shadows of the past and becoming more open, more focused on the future. And there is some of that, but it's limited. The show decides to have Pearl be still this person who is very devoted to the way things were. And that's not a bad thing artistically, and in fact, it's an interesting aesthetic choice that the show makes. Compare her to Amethyst, who is portrayed as being younger, and this avatar of change, of optimism, of trying new things, of kind of being weird and silly at times, but ultimately able to form new impressions and new ideas, as emblematized by her shape-shifting powers. She, like the relatively younger person, she's an analogy for, in a way. She is more pliable, more malleable in a lot of ways. And then there's Garnet, who is this embodiment of two people who went against the expectations placed on them and found love together. So both of those characters are, in different ways, embodiments of change and transformation. And Stephen, of course, is that too. And that's what Rose says. What's wonderful about Stephen is that he can be whoever he wants to be. He can change. He's not set in this formal path. He is human, and being human, he can be whoever he wants to be. There is a fundamental pliability to his nature. Even someone like Greg is this kind of freewheeling hippie sort who loves going against the expectations of other people. And in a way, that's one reason why Rose fell for him in the first place. And he fundamentally went against his more clean-cut upbringing. But Pearl is a bit different. She is in many ways somewhat conservative. That might be a weird word to apply to anyone in this show, but in a non-political sense, more of an ideological, philosophical sense, it's true for Pearl. Especially with the revelations that we have in later in the show that Rose is Pink Diamond and Pearl was just her Pearl. Pearl is locked into this spirit of devotion, of this kind of knightly, courtly love for Rose Quartz. Rose Quartz is everything to her, and she will give herself completely to Rose Quartz, including in ways that are not the most healthy. As demonstrated when she is training Connie. There is humor in that, and the immediate tension of, oh hey, Connie can't survive that. And it's not healthy for her, but it's not healthy for Pearl either. Of all the characters in the show, the one whose basic way of being in the world most clashes with the fundamental ideals of the show the most is probably Pearl. And that's what I find interesting to her. That doesn't make her a villain of the show or an antagonist, but it does highlight her imperfections. She is a character, above all, defined by her inability to move on, and there is a hidden, laden layer of pathos, both in the classical sense and in the sense of it just being kind of pathetic in a pitiable way, that she has never really changed, in a sense. She was devoted to her diamond, and then she became devoted to Rose Quartz, and her feelings became even stronger. I am still somewhat conflicted on the reveal of Rose being Pink Diamond, not because it's not clearly choreographed, it is, but because of what it means for Pearl as a character. It places her in a more critical position as someone who can't really change, as someone who is just tied to Rose/Pink forever. But there is real pathos to that. There is real emotionality. It's not that she can't have new experiences. One of the most fun episodes of the show is the one where she chases down that punk-looking girl who has the long pink hair, and Pearl is clearly in love with her, at least attracted to her. Now, it's not that there isn't still a connection to Rose. There obviously is, especially with the hair, but it does represent an instance of Pearl trying to move forward, trying to have new experiences, trying to be more open to other possibilities. But for the most part, Pearl isn't quite like that. Freud talks in Mourning and Melancholia about mourning as being this natural process wherein we feel that a part of ourself, which has been inevitably connected to the other person, is gone now. We know ourselves, in a sense, through being connected with others, and when that connection is gone, there is a deep sorrow. But for Freud, in a relatively normal process, this is something we can, if not completely move past, then at least ameliorate by forming new connections. That part of ourself that was given to someone is transferred, in a sense, to someone else. Perhaps a new romantic partner, perhaps another kind of connection. Doesn't have to be romantic. But for Pearl, that never really happens. The person she attempts to try to transfer some of those feelings to is Stephen, but this is inevitably an imperfect process because she struggles to fully understand that Stephen is not her beloved Rose. And she, though she deeply, deeply loves Stephen, still has trouble really figuring him out or understanding how to help him. Pearl is a wonderful character in this show, and she is wonderful specifically because she is imperfect, because her ideals do not necessarily match with the ideals of the show. What she values is this commitment, this devotion, this loyalty, and her sense of what love is very tied to those values. But these values are somewhat contrary to the ideals of the show, which are about multiplicity, diversity, tolerance, and this openness to new experience. Pearl is wonderfully, fascinatingly imperfect, and that's why I remain so intrigued by her character. So thank you all for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can, and you want to see more videos like this before anyone else. Keep watching Steven Universe. It's a great show, and I continue to be fascinated by Pearl. To use a comparison I guarantee you no one has used before, she is somewhat reminiscent of King Arthur in Tennyson's version of the character in Idylls of the King. This deep, passionate idealist who is nonetheless left adrift in a world where those ideals do not really apply. Take care, everyone. Adios, comrades.